We are building the welcome message project from the YByte Python curriculum available at www.ybyte.in. We have previously taken the short code, the name strength, and built a function to do preliminary validation. Now it's the moment where we send our data that we have obtained so far for, let's say, a deep validation. Let's say for our, for the sake of our project, perhaps this runs on some kind of a remote server. So we're going to open a new connection to that server. And all of this only when the preliminary validation passes. Now, before you get your hopes too high or before you start imagining too much, let me do a little bit of a spoiler here. In fact, as we will see, this deep validation is probably going to be like a little bit of a gotcha movement for you. We are going to do something quite anticlimactic here, right? But the idea is, again, the Python concepts that we are using, we are going to write this code in a very interesting manner. Remember, the deep validation is kind of deep happening somewhere, and it can also fail. Now let's look at our code over here. We, if we call the deep validation from, let's say, the validate function, provided the previous stages have been okay, and provided the user did not make any mistake in providing the preliminary data, which means both the dictionary keys were named correctly. Having done all this, I come into else and I say sending for deeper validation. Now, again, obviously, deeper validation itself can fail, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. I will first write a function to do, let's say, deep validate. Now one may think it's like some very complicated thing that's going to happen. And I'm going to have, let's say, a dictionary being passed into this. We assume that this is sort of running on some kind of like a remote server or something like that. We will in fact do something very simple here. So let me just, do something quite random. I am just going to say, well, import, for example, random in the beginning of this project. So import, say, random. Now I will just find out two random numbers. So, first I'll just say print prelim data. So it looks, say somewhat cool. I just say print prelim data. Now you can in fact add some more graphics here, some more, let's say, suspense over here to think that something really deep is going on. But all I'll do is that I'll just create two thresholds. So two thresh, let's say thresh for, say threshold for, let's say, SC. And I just say, well, that's a random dot, let's say rand int. Perhaps let's say between 80 and 100. Now I'm intentionally choosing this to be quite large. And threshold for, let's say, say threshold for, let's say, name strength. Again, I'm just keeping a random number, random dot, say, rand int. Let's say between 2000 and say 3000. Now, again, these are just numbers. You can play with them. I will print these two as though something really big is going on. Threshold NS, threshold SC, without telling what they are. So these are like some kind of internal data. And I'll just find out if my, let's say the values that I'm getting, are they, for example, more than this threshold or not. So what I'll do, and this is just all quite arbitrary, by the way, I just go and say, look, if len of, let's say, prelim data, remember the keys are SC, the short code. So I just look at the prelim data SC, which is the short code for me. If that is more than, or let's say that is less than threshold SC, which means that it's smaller than, let's say, in my short code is, let's say, smaller than 80 characters, most likely it will be. Let's say, or let's say I get my, let's say, prelim data, say, NS. Now remember, prelim data is a dictionary which we are sending in with exactly these keys. So I just go, let's say, if this is less than threshold of, let's say, name string, if one of these condition comes true, which will very highly likely it will come true, I will go and, just declare that, look, my validation has failed. Now, in this case, I want to tell this information that validation has failed as an error. And I'll do something very, very interesting, something we've not done before. I am going to say, well, let me raise an error over here. So I just go and raise, for example, a value error. Right now, why do I choose value error? Well, because in this case, basically, it's kind of telling that, look, the value for the things that I was expecting is not quite what I wanted. And hence, I am raising a value error. In fact, I can raise any error I can even create custom errors and raise them. But for now, this is fine. Why do I do this and how is this useful to me? Well, because remember, I am calling, I'm calling this function from inside my validate function. I will once again do a try and except to to sort of see what happened with my, let's say, deep validation. But before going there, let us just, let's say, test this function a little bit. So I just realized that there was a typo over here. So I just fixed that to, let's say, randint. Now we'll see this function working. When I do this, for example, let's say I create a prelim data dictionary. In reality, it will get created inside the validate function. But let's say I just create this from outside right now. Two keys, SC and NS. SC is say VWB, NS is say 1000. If I were to do a deep validate, let's say on, so deep validate, let's say prelim data. Clearly, this will fail because, obviously my shortcode is very small. The interesting bit is how does my validation fail? Notice first it prints prelim data. It, prints, let's say, some numbers, which I don't know what they mean. Basically the threshold for these two. And obviously I come into this else. I come into this if condition because my, my length of, let's say, shortcode is just too small, right? But notice what has happened here. I have raised a value error, which means that in fact, this is as though I gave a wrong value and hence this can also be handled later on, we see. So this is pretty interesting. Actually, we are raising an error just like, sometimes previously errors were happening out of our control where let's say user gave, for example, an integer instead of a string, or a user gave, let's say, a wrong index into a list and so on and so forth. In fact, I can raise errors in any situation. For example, let's say I have a variable a is 10. I can just say, well, if a is, let's say, less than 100, well, raise, let's say, value error. And once I do this, notice I do get a value error, right? So now I'm raising this error. It did not happen because of some external input. In fact, I'm intentionally doing this. The reason for this will become clear because we will use this in the validate function later on. Yeah, we'll come back to that in just in the next video. But I hope this has been interesting to you. Make this function interesting because this is the sort of like the root of it. You can do a lot of things on this. You can be a bit more, let's say a little bit more liberal on the user and perhaps sometimes allow the validation to go through. But it's quite creative and avenue. In general, if you think this way of learning works for you, where we are applying concepts, keeping things quite interactive, in general, if you think this way of learning works for you, where we are applying concepts, building activities and learning through them, well, look at our website because that is how we learn Python programming. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.